So just maybe a brief introduction before I start. So my name is Olga Yudina. I'm with the Source Protection Programs branch at the Ministry of Environment and Climate Change. And as Carly mentioned, I'll start us off this morning with a fairly brief overview of the Source Protection Program. So perhaps this is an introduction to some, but most likely sort of a refresher for those of you that are already familiar with the program. So my goal today is to provide you with a background of this program, why it was established, and generally what it aims to achieve, and also provide an overview of the science-based, locally driven approach to establishing the vulnerable areas, assessing the risk to drinking water, as well as ensuring that there are mechanisms in place to address those risks. And you'll notice that some of the slides have a bit more detail than I'll be speaking to today, so I just wanted to offer those to you as a reference, but we'll cover some of that information at a fairly high level today. So after the tragic events of 2000 in Walkerton, the province of Ontario took action to ensure that our drinking water is among the best protected in the world. And so following the Walkerton inquiry, Justice O'Connor made 121 recommendations, and these were on a wide range of issues related to drinking water. And these really are the building blocks of Ontario's drinking water safety net. And the first step is really source protection. So that is protecting the surface and the groundwater that's supplying municipal residential drinking water systems. So the Clean Water Act ensures that communities protect their drinking water through prevention. So the backbone is really collaborative, watershed-based source protection plans that are locally driven and based on science. The Act does rely on existing tools and mechanisms to manage or eliminate risks to drinking water. But it also does establish new powers under Part 4 for municipalities. So this is additional municipal authority that was really intended to fill the gaps where existing tools couldn't sufficiently address risk to drinking water. And I'll return to this a little bit later in the presentation. So under the Clean Water Act, 38 source protection areas have been established across Ontario, and these are generally speaking based on Conservation Authority boundaries. In these areas, source protection plans are now in place for municipal residential drinking water systems. But while the focus really is on municipal systems, the Act does enable municipalities to include private systems, for instance, clusters of private wells or systems serving First Nations communities in their source protection plan. So I know this is fairly small, but this map is just showing the 38 source protection areas across Ontario, and they are grouped into 10 regions and 9 standalone areas. So there are really a total of 19 unique source protection planning areas, and each has a source protection committee. I wanted to mention some of the key players in the source protection process briefly. So the source protection committees have historically and continue to play a key role in the program, including the development of the assessment reports as well as the source protection plans. There's equal representation on the committees of the municipal, economic, and other interests, for instance, environmental or community groups. Source protection authorities or conservation authorities have also played an instrumental role in the process. So among many other roles, they provide technical support to the committees, and they also support the implementation of the program in various ways. So I don't want to go into much detail on this slide, but really the purpose was to show you the general source protection planning process, which involves the completion of the technical studies that were used to develop the assessment reports, which then informed the policy approaches that you see in the local source protection plans across the source protection areas or regions. And this entire process also involves a mechanism to ensure that the science and the policy of source protection remain relevant and up to date as time goes on. So assessment reports developed by the source protection committees and authorities, they pull together the results of the technical and the scientific studies for each source protection area. They identify the locations of existing and planned municipal drinking water systems, and they assess how vulnerable these source water supplying those systems are. And they also assess the activities that can pose a risk to these drinking water sources. Assessment reports do consider both water quality and water quantity. So in other words, they assess the vulnerability of groundwater or surface water to contamination, but also to depletion. And this local information is then used to delineate 4 types of vulnerable areas, which are listed on the slide. So intake protection zones, wellhead protection areas, significant groundwater recharge areas, and highly vulnerable aquifers. And we'll talk about those in detail in the coming slides. And there are also 2 additional areas that can be identified within those previous 4 areas. And again, we'll discuss those a little bit later. So vulnerable areas around surface water intakes are known as intake protection zones, or IPZs for short. So these zones are created based on modeling and local site characteristics, and they capture the area where potential contaminants can flow to the intake. So IPZ1 is the zone that's closest to the intake, and it's considered the most vulnerable. IPZ2 is the zone that's farther upstream from the intake, where direct impacts to the drinking water sources are possible. And IPZ3, generally speaking, is the zone where activities can impact source water, but there is time to take action so that the intake and municipal water aren't impacted. Intake protection zones are assigned vulnerability scores, and these scores reflect how vulnerable an intake is to becoming contaminated. So the higher the score, the greater the risk of contamination. Scores can differ based on the type of intake, but they're also influenced by other types of factors like soil permeability, slope, water flow direction, as well as some others. And significant threats can occur in zones with a score of 8 or higher, and there are a few exceptions. So another vulnerable area that you're likely familiar with is the wellhead protection area, or WAPA for short. So WAPAs are areas around a well that have the highest chance of impacting the quality of the water that's flowing to that well. And these areas are generally created using modeling that looks at the time that it takes for the water to travel to that well. So each WAPA consists of at least 4 sub-areas, as you see on the slide, A through D. And they can include other areas also where there's evidence that the groundwater is influenced by the surface water. So like IPZs, wellhead protection areas are paired with groundwater vulnerability scores. And the scores reflect how vulnerable the groundwater is to becoming contaminated, and they range from 2 to 10, as is noted on the slide. So again, the higher the score, the greater the risk of contamination to that groundwater source. And the significance of these scores is that they're important to determining the level of risk that's posed by an activity in a given vulnerable area and score. And we'll talk about that a little bit later as well in more detail. So wellhead protection areas and intake protection zones can also indicate where water quantity is at risk, as I mentioned before. And this is done through water budget work. So without going into a lot of detail, this type of analysis takes into account how much water enters the watershed and how much water leaves the watershed to determine whether the water source and the system are vulnerable to depletion. And this analysis has a tiered approach, so the higher the level or the tier, the more complex the science, and the narrower the geographical focus of that particular study. So where this water budget work shows that the system is vulnerable to depletion, the protection zones that you see on the slide are delineated. So a WAPA Q1 is an area around a well where consumptive taking of water can pose a risk. WAPA Q2 is an area where the reduction of recharge can pose a risk to the drinking water source. And IPZQ is an area around an intake where either one of those activities could pose a risk to the sustainability of that particular water source. So SGRAs, or significant groundwater recharge areas, are also delineated as part of this water quantity work. And these are areas where the recharge of the aquifer, for instance through the seeping of water through the ground, exceeds the average recharge rate in the rest of the watershed. So these are areas that often have more permeable soil, and they allow the water to seep more easily through the ground to the aquifer. Another vulnerable area that you'll see in an assessment report is the highly vulnerable aquifer, or HVA. So an HVA is an aquifer that can easily be contaminated because the overlaying soil is thin or permeable. So the faster that the water flows through the ground to the aquifer, the more vulnerable it is to contamination. And HVAs do factor into the scores of wellhead protection areas, and that's really to make sure that the increased risk of these aquifers to contamination is taken into account in the final wellhead protection area score. So those are the 4 vulnerable areas that you would see in an assessment report. But what are the activities that we're concerned about under the Clean Water Act? So the Act prescribes 22 activities as potential drinking water threats. So these are activities that can adversely affect the water source, and 20 activities can impact water quality, and 2 activities can impact water quantity. So the tables of drinking water threats, which are established under the Clean Water Act, they also set out circumstances under which an activity can pose a significant, moderate, or low drinking water threat in a given vulnerable area and score. And speaking from experience, I know these tables can be fairly overwhelming to navigate, and that's why we now have very excellent tools that you can use to interpret that information. So to identify when a particular activity under certain circumstances can pose a significant degree of risk to a drinking water source in a given vulnerable area and score. And Andy will showcase that a little bit later today. So these are the 22 prescribed drinking water threat activities. And as you see here, there are some that are particularly relevant to agriculture. For instance, we have the application and storage of ASM, the application and storage of NASM, application of commercial fertilizer to land. There are other types of activities, for instance, the handling and storage of fuel or organic solvents. And I would just encourage you to familiarize yourself with the 22 drinking water threats so that you're aware of the range of activities that are considered potential risk to drinking water under the Clean Water Act framework. So in addition to the 22 prescribed drinking water threats, the technical framework does allow for conditions as well as local threats to be identified as risk to drinking water. So conditions refer to contamination related to historical activities. So for instance, if the soil or the groundwater have been contaminated due to previous activities on that site. Other types of activities in certain source protection areas or regions have been identified as local threats. And this requires ministry approval, but these are activities that aren't assessed across the province, but are of local concern. So as an example, nuclear power stations or the transportation of hazardous substances, for instance. So we've talked about the different vulnerable areas, vulnerability scores, as well as the drinking water threat activities. But what determines whether an activity is, let's say, a significant drinking water risk in a particular vulnerable area? So there were 3 approaches to determining this. The first approach is the threats approach, and this uses a formula to assess the degree of risk, and it considers 2 factors. So the first is the vulnerability of the drinking water source to contamination, and the second is the hazard score that was assigned to each activity based on factors like toxicity or release to the environment. The second is an issues approach. So this involves delineating an issues contributing area, or an ICA for short. So this approach identifies existing contaminants that are impacting the drinking water system. For instance, chloride, phosphorus, nitrate, E. coli. And this vulnerable area, the ICA, is then delineated so that activities within the ICA that can contribute to that particular pathogen or chemical of concern can be elevated to significant threats. And so measures are in place to ensure those particular activities or the risk to drinking water is addressed appropriately. The third approach to identifying the threats to drinking water is the event-based approach, so EBA for short. EBAs are areas within intake protection zones where a spill from an activity under extreme storm events could contaminate the drinking water supply. So EBAs are delineated using modeling and monitoring data. And some examples, different types of activities have been modeled across the source protection areas. Examples are spill of oil from a pipeline, a spill of sewage from a wastewater treatment plant. So all three of these approaches, so the threats approach that takes into account the area vulnerability score as well as the hazard score of that particular activity, the issues approach, and the event-based approach, what they really do is they culminate in us being able to identify the degree of risk that an activity can pose to a drinking water source in a given vulnerable area and score. And again, later on today, you'll see some of the tools that are available now to help us do that more easily. So all of this rigorous technical work was used to inform the development of source protection plans. And I wanted to conclude the presentation today by talking about the source protection plans and the policies that they contain, so the measures to address some of these risks to drinking water. So the local plans contain policies to address existing and future activities that can pose a risk to drinking water sources. It was mandatory for source protection committees to include policies that address significant drinking water threats, and it was optional to include policies that addressed risks that are moderate or low. And the legal effect of the policies varies, and that depends on the risk level of the activity. So again, whether it poses significant, moderate, or low risk to drinking water, the policy tool that was used, and we'll see the policy tools on the next slide, as well as the implementing body. So the policies range from mandatory implementation by that implementing body to voluntary. I think I have about two slides left, and what they do is they try to display the range of policy tools that were available to source protection committees. So the Clean Water Act enables policy tools to be used to address significant threats, and these really are either manage or prohibit a particular drinking water threat activity. And as you would have seen on the slide, some of the tools are more restrictive than others. So there's a range, and it's best displayed visually, but the least restrictive is a policy, for instance, that calls for education and outreach or for incentive policies, and the most restrictive is a policy, for instance, that prohibits a particular activity altogether. And to wrap up, I want to just highlight a few of the tools for you that might be particularly relevant. So and you'll see, I believe you will have access to the presentation. So you'll see on the slide, for instance, that there are 3 tools under Part 4 of the Clean Water Act. And these, as I mentioned before, are new authorities for municipalities. So a source protection plan can contain policies that require that a risk management plan be established to address a significant drinking water threat activity. So for instance, the application and storage of nutrients could be subject to a risk management plan policy. And these plans are site-specific documents that outline required measures that have to be in place to address a particular threat activity. So these plans are established and enforced by the municipality, and more specifically, it's the risk management official who is appointed by the municipality who negotiates these plans with the person that's engaged in that particular threat activity. And Mary Lynn will talk about risk management plans a little bit later in the morning. Local source protection plans also contain policies that affect land use planning decisions under the Planning Act and Condominium Act. as well as policies that affect prescribed instrument decisions. So policies that affect decisions to issue, amend, or revoke a prescribed instrument, like an environmental compliance approval or an instrument under the Nutrient Management Act, like a strategy or a plan. And I'll stop there, and hopefully that's a good segue into our next presentation by Taryn. And he'll talk in a bit more detail about prescribed instruments and policies that affect the approvals of those particular instruments in more detail. Thank you.